Hello everyone, welcome to another update video. It's been a while since the last one, but before I go any further, you should probably temper your expectations here because the last 2 months have been taken up with the context sensitivity video for me. Actually, in the last update video that I made, I said that I spent March working on something that I hoped you would one day see, and that something was the context sensitivity video. So it's been in the works for a while, and I'm glad to finally have that out. And I'll be refocusing on development now. I know some of you expressed concern that maybe the upload of a video was a bad sign for the projects. That's not the case, but it has obviously taken time away from it. So there's only a limited amount I've been able to get done with the time that I've had. But despite that, there's been a lot of improvements across many different areas. So again, kind of like the last one, this is going to be a scattershot video of lots of different little things, mostly improvements to systems you've already seen or kind of extensions to systems you've seen before. Before I go any further though, I just want to point out that this sprite for the main character, I think this is the first time I'm showing it in a video. And this is obviously temp, just like the scarab is temp as well. These were just mocked up in about the span of an hour, and it's just there to help me figure out the player character's actions and stuff like that, which I'll get into a little bit more later in the video. Okay, so the first thing I want to show off is the room transitions have been upgraded a little bit. If you take a look at this here, so it's kind of similar to what you've seen before, but you might notice that this one isn't. This is kind of a linear movement from left to right across the screen, but it's not interpolating linearly. This seems like a good time to say, anytime I've been talking about curves in the prior videos, if you were confused about what I'm talking about, it might have made more sense for me to talk about interpolation so that you can at least look that up and get an easier understanding of it if you want to look up some other material about what I'm talking about. What I'm really talking about is interpolation, right? It's about how you get from point A to point B. And before, the screen transitions just used linear interpolation, but now they can have a curve applied to them. Now, you could kind of fake it before, because what happens is it's kind of a two-part process. There's the interpolation you want to use, which is the curve, but there's also a dedicated image for the screen transition, which decides how it moves across the screen, which is how in previous videos I demonstrated ones that are kind of blocky, or have all different kinds of shapes and sizes to them. So that's done by making an image which is grayscale. So for example, for this image, it would be black on the left, white on the right, and everywhere in between it would just fade from one to the other. But even though this image is just a linear fade, because it has a curve applied to it, you get that little bit of lingering towards the end, which is what I was after. And I think it just makes it that little bit more professional. And along similar lines, the transitions, they used to be black and white, but now they actually use a slightly more complex system where they use all three color channels. Because if you just go from black to white, you're using all three color channels equally, which only gives you 255 values. For the kinds of screen transitions we'd normally be using in a game like this, because I like to keep things snappy and I don't want to take you out of the game for too long, that's probably fine. But let's say we might have a couple of transitions where we want to punctuate things a little bit more, or maybe, we move on to a different game where they play a different role, right? In that case, we might want to have more granularity on the amount, on how the transitions happen, so that if it takes a long time, it still looks nice and smooth. And it also plays a part in these curves, I think, because when it gets to the end of the curve here and it's kind of disappearing very slowly, it's making quite small steps for those last few frames because it's slowed down. And if you don't use if you don't have a high enough level of granularity, then it might look jittery or jumpy, or you might not get quite the result that you want, right? So the one that I use, it's only a very slight complexity increase. There's probably more complex things you can do by multiplying the color channels or multiplying and then adding them together. But this is just a straight addition, right? So instead of having 255 values, essentially we have 765 values. I think it's somewhere around there anyway. So we get to use the red, green and blue channels all together, and it just smooths it out that little bit. So just a little bit of polish on that one as well. Now this is an addition to the shader system that I showed off before. Might be a little bit hard to see in the video, but the background has a film grain effect on it. Down below, there's the collider tiles, which are normally orange, have turned grey. And you can see that these kind of billboard things that I've just put into test transparency, right? They one of them is in the foreground and one of them is in the background, right? So the one in the foreground has a gradient map applied to it, just like before when I was changing the color of the screen in the shader video. So it's the same thing that's happening there. But the one in the background remains unchanged. So what this is it's layer specific shaders. And I did have to do a little bit of reworking to get this done because I didn't want to. I wanted to have this option without having to rewrite all the shaders that I already have. So the kind of parent shader object that I have has to have two modes to it now. It has to have a post-processing mode, which affects the whole screen, or it has to have a per layer mode, or a layer-specific mode is what I've called it, where it can just affect certain layers and not other layers. A little bit of game maker specific knowledge here that won't be relevant to anybody but seems worth bringing up is when I was researching this, the way Game Maker seems to suggest going about this is with a thing called layer script begin, right? And I tried that out first because it seemed like the right way to do it. And when I was testing the gradient map, I got kind of an interesting result because, you know, in these videos, like in general, if you're using a map to change the color of something, you probably, you know, you don't want it hooked up to a key the way I have right here, right? I'm just pressing a key to change it, and I have it done that way so I can demonstrate it and test it and all that kind of stuff. But what I noticed was I have it set up very naively to just look at the keyboard input and increment by one if it finds keyboard input, right? Because it's just for testing. And I noticed that it was actually incrementing by the number of objects it was used to draw, which to me indicates that it's actually resetting and setting the shader uniforms every time it draws a new object if you use that approach, if you use layer script begin. My impression was that this would be a script that would run at the start of the layer, you know, and that's it. But actually it seems to run for every object which is drawn, which isn't ideal, right? Now I haven't done any profiling on this, but it just makes sense to me that in a lot of cases, most cases maybe, you probably just want to set up the shader uniforms once and then draw the whole layer, everything that's on the layer, and then turn it off. So the approach that I landed on, which I think is more efficient, again, I didn't profile it. I probably should have, but then again, it's using the GPU. So anyway, the approach that I landed on was to actually just make a separate layer. So if you picture the layer list in Game Maker, behind, like below the background layer, there's a thing that just switches the film grain shader on. Then there's the background layer, and then above the background layer there's another dedicated layer which is just has a special object on it which just switches shaders off. Okay, and you need to do that because you can't turn a shader on if you already have one on, right? So you just have to remember to put another thing behind it that switches it off. And the nice thing about that, though, is that you can actually kind of just drag these up and down in the room editor, right? So if you want the shader to cover half of the layers in the game, all the back half of the game, you can do that by just taking the off switch and moving it higher up on the hierarchy so that it only switches off later, okay? And I suppose the work here was just making sure that I wouldn't have to rewrite the shaders and that the general shader object could be done either way, right? So now the big benefit of this is I write a shader once and I can use it either way, right? Probably not all shaders will play nicely with both modes, but it's there and I just have to toggle a switch to get the shader acting one way or another way. Another thing I want to talk about, and I hope to finally put this issue to bed now, but I'm going to drudge it up again, is the action transition thing and the priority thing that I've been talking about in some prior videos. I called this the frame A, frame B problem. One commenter gave me the terms link and cancel, which I think is what they're called in fighting games. I don't know which one is which one is the link and which one is the cancel, right? But so the frame A, frame B thing about when we want the player to be able to move into a new state. Now, I haven't re-implemented Victor because I don't want to put his sprites back in and all that kind of stuff, but I have put in an uppercut, which now looks like this, and a dash, which now looks like that, okay? So the dash is new. Now, Richter in Symphony of the Night actually has a dash, and I never implemented it, and I should have, because implementing him was like the best thing I've done on this whole project, and I really should have gone with that all the way, right? And it would have highlighted this problem more clearly. I think I actually had a grasp of this at some point in the past when I first started thinking about this, and somewhere along the way I lost sight of it, right? Recently, the way I've been thinking about this was about two competing states, right? The example I used was you uppercut and then you go into a falling state. And I wanted to make sure that the player sees one frame of the falling state before they can uppercut again. But actually, there can be multiple competing states all at once, of course, right? This is the part that I overlooked. What I had done to solve this problem was imagine this is the first frame of the falling animation. I had just set it so that the player's decision making would basically be blocked for this frame. You couldn't do anything. You're locked into it for this one frame, okay? Now, I did foresee an issue with this, and this, again, should have copped me on to the idea that there was something wrong here, but this will only really play nicely if there's an input buffer, right? Because if the player presses a button, they expect it to do something. And my thinking was, okay, I'll just delay that till the next frame, right? The input buffer will catch that and do whatever the player wants to do, right? But let's imagine we don't have an input buffer, and the game might not have an input buffer, as I talked about. Well, now what happens? Okay. Let me just give some example values here, okay? Let's say that falling has a priority of 200, okay? And uppercutting has a priority of 300. But dashing has a priority of 400. So dashing is a very high priority action, right? It'll override basically anything else we can do. And this means that if you're uppercutting, you can dash. But also if you're falling, you can dash, right? If I just went with my prior approach of, okay, the player is blocked from doing anything for that frame, this means that if I press the dash button, and remember I have no input buffer, right? Let's just imagine I press it one frame, I don't get a dash. When normally if I'm falling, I dash, and if I'm uppercutting, I dash. So why is there this one frame where I can't dash, right? That's the problem. So instead, the way that I've done this now, and I think this finally puts it to rest, is every action has a boolean I can toggle when I'm setting it up, which is called delay priority decrease. And it does exactly what it says. It means that if you were in an uppercut and you're going into the falling state, you get one frame where you keep your old priority. So for this frame of falling, the priority is still 300. And it's only on the next frame that it goes down to the 200. And that can be toggled for every action. So basically it's totally within my control now, whether it's frame A, frame B, link or cancel, whatever you want to call it. I can just tick that box when I want it, or when I don't want it. And it also means that we don't get these weird situations where you have a really high priority action that gets arbitrarily blocked off, right? So I think this is exactly what I've been after the whole time. And enough words have been said about this whole problem, so I'll leave it there. But I think that finally puts it to rest. And the nice thing, of course, is just that I have it. It's just a toggle now. When I'm setting up an action, I just toggle it. I just say what I want and it does it. Okay, let's skip ahead a little bit. Stash is handy here, but maybe I should take this as an opportunity to talk about the design philosophy a little bit. There won't be a dash in the game, right? Obviously, this arrow was just added for your benefit and to show off that little priority problem that I had there. I don't know how much I really want to talk about this, but I've just been thinking about the game, and I think in games like Castlevania and Ghosts and Goblins, you move very slowly, and in this game, you move even slower, okay? That's how it is for now. Maybe it'll speed up somewhere along the way. But the movement speed is quite slow, and that's deliberate. It's to force you to engage with the enemies and think about what you're doing and all that kind of stuff. Of course, like the samurai, to me, I don't know if you'll disagree, but to me, he looks like a character that should move slowly, that has a bit of heft. And of course, if you saw the picture of him, he looks a little bit older, right? A lot of you got that impression, which was what we were going for. He's maybe not old Snake levels of old, but he's up there, right? He's maybe past his prime a little bit, so he's not very spry, and that's the way it's going to be. Hopefully, anyway, that's the way I intend for it to be right now. But this little dash will help me get around faster for this demonstration, at least. Okay, we have a different color of tile. Brace yourself, right? Okay, this is a semi-solid tile, which I showed off on the Patreon, but I don't think they've been in a video yet. These work exactly the way you would expect them to work. I think people are familiar with semi-solids now, and they're familiar with the terminology from Mario Maker as well. So probably not much use dwelling on this too much. I do have 2 points to say here, though. The first one is that semi-solids are, for as much trouble as I've had with collisions, it generally has been making progress the whole time I've been doing them, right? Pretty much everything I've done, I've been making progress the whole time I've done it. Sometimes that progress is good and sometimes it's not so good, but generally at the end of the day, a little bit has been chipped away and like there's been a step forward of some kind, right? Semi-solids are the only case where I've had to roll back, and I've done it several times because I just wasn't happy with how I implemented them. Now, I'm not sure how much this explanation will make sense, but I'll try and explain where I was going wrong and how I eventually corrected the problem. As I talked about in the past, this game uses sensors, axis-aligned sensors, to figure out whether or not you're touching tiles. And I didn't want to do it in the way that this is part of where the complexity comes from. In old games like Sonic, if Sonic wants to check whether he's standing on the floor, he fires sensors downwards. I think he does two, one on his left and one on his right. He fires sensors downwards to see if there's something beneath him, okay? But I don't know how other games do this. I haven't had help on this, but so maybe I've gone about this totally the wrong way. But I didn't want to just do things the way things would be done on a Mega Drive because computers are so much faster these days. I figured I could get something more robust so that I could have all kinds of different tile shapes and I didn't have to worry about what was there. We could just put stuff together in different ways and it would just work, right? Now, there's still limitations on this, but there's not a lot of them, right? Like I got rid of 40 slopes that go over 45 degrees, but they were still technically working correctly. You weren't clipping through them or anything like that. They just weren't fun because there was no interaction with them and they just kind of made it unclear whether it was a wall or not, So I think it's a fairly robust system at this point, and the way it got there was by abandoning that approach of shooting sensors downwards when you want to look down and reversing the whole concept, right? So the player moves pixel by pixel. Everything moves pixel by pixel now because I sped it up so much that I'm comfortable doing it that way. That was in the prior video with where the collision improvements happened, right? He moves pixel by pixel, and because he moves pixel by pixel, the sensors can be reversed, right? So when you want to check if there's ground underneath you, it doesn't use a vertical sensor to check for that. It uses a horizontal sensor at his feet to check, is there anything? Is there even 1 pixel of floor here, right? Now, the bounding box on this doesn't match up perfectly, but as you can see, right, you can get right off the edge and it's still there. It still knows where he is, okay? So it's doing it the other way around. And likewise, if you imagine the sword here, picture the sword as a sensor going down the whole body. Well, that'll tell you if there's a wall anywhere in that range, right? That's the way this approach works. The downside is that it'll only tell you if there's a wall there for that column of pixels, and you need to check the next one separately, right? So that made semi-solids a bit complicated because it wasn't just a matter of saying, okay, if I'm firing a downward sensor, I need to care about semi-solids. And if I'm firing a sensor in any other direction, I don't need to care, right? That would be the simplest way to do it if you were using an older approach where downward sensors test floor, upward sensors test ceiling, sideward sensors test walls. But it's a bit more complicated doing it the way I'm doing it because the sideways sensors test for both floor and ceiling, but only the floor interaction needs to care about semi-solids, right? Now, basically, I was approaching this at the kind of sensor level and I was trying to figure out, okay, when I'm in the sensor, I figure out if it's a semi-solid and whether or not I care about it, blah, blah, blah. But the key to this whole problem was to just take it up another step in the chain. And generally, this is the way I've been approaching problems, and I think it works out, is that if you want to minimize the amount of work you need to do and come up with a clean solution, you kind of want to tackle stuff as high up the chain as is reasonable to go, right? So what I mean by that is instead of trying to manipulate the sensors, which is kind of slow anyway, right? If a sensor has a check, if a sensor has an if statement in it, that's kind of costly because they're very tightly wound things that are firing a lot of times per frame, and they're, they kind of chain off each other to carry down for, long lengths so you can check big distances and stuff like that. So instead, scrap all that, right? And what the game does now is when you walk into a room, so this happened when I walked into this room. Every time the screen transitioned happened earlier, this has been happening. I might as well just walk back up here while I'm talking about it. What happens is the game actually builds a separate collider layer that has no semi-solids on it. So it's doing that right there while the screen transition happens, right? It has, by default, I build the map with the semi-solids built in, but then when the game loads a new room, it builds a whole separate collision layer and just deletes all the semi-solids. And then when it comes time to figure out what an interaction is, I just give it the layer with the semi-solids or without the semi-solids, and the sensors will just see or not see something then that way. They don't have to know whether they're talking to semi-solids or whatever. They just say, is there something here or not, right? I've been given this layer and I'll just do my sensor shit against it as I normally do, and I don't need to care. And the great thing is, actually, there's a couple of great things about this, but even the way it is now is acceptable, I think. So this room is very big. It actually carries on. The height is about 3 times bigger than this. It goes down below here where there's nothing down there, but it's just a big room for some reason. And it goes over a lot, right? Even bigger than I'm going to show in this video. It carries off to the right a lot. So as far as Mushido is concerned, especially, this is a very big room because the movement speed in this game will be slow. For a different game, it might be, a medium-sized room or something like that, but it's still fairly big. And when I timed this, it turns out that using this approach only adds 1 extra frame of loading to the load screen when you move between rooms, okay? And even then, it's not optimized. I'm sure there's ways I could optimize it. I don't know, maybe it's even single-threaded at the moment, and you could imagine this being a thing that could very easily be multi-threaded. I don't know if that's even possible in Game Maker, but anyway. But the nice thing is, you don't even have to do a complex approach like that, because another thing that could be done is once the game is finished, I could just manually go in and create a second layer and just manually delete all the semi-solids, and now it doesn't have to be built in real time, right? You definitely want this real-time approach while you're still in development, because you want to be able to change maps very quickly and not have to worry that you've made a mistake where you've somehow fucked up a map by deleting something that you shouldn't have, right? But at this stage, you do it this way, and then later maybe you can do it that way. Or maybe the middle ground approach, probably the most professional middle ground approach, would be to have a tool that you can use, that you run, that just generates that automatically, right? It puts it in the folder with the other layer, and you don't do any of it in Game Maker. You just manipulate the file directly yourself. Maybe I'll take a crack at that just for fun, but I don't know. That would probably be the most professional approach, because it would have all of the speed benefits and you wouldn't have any human error in the process, But the point is, there's a way to make this even faster if needs be. So I'm very happy with this approach. I was really worried when I made those big collision gains that I was going to have to give up all that speed when I put semi-solids back in. But actually, they cost nothing performance-wise now, which is great. So very happy with how they work. And of course, they function as you'd expect. You can jump up through them, but you can't fall through them. And not even if you crouch and jump can you fall through them. This is another reason why I wanted to do the context sensitivity video now, because this could have been a huge diatribe at this point in the video, but hopefully you'll understand what I say now. You'll understand what I mean when I say having the ability to fall through a semi-solid floor by holding crouch and pressing jump introduces a level of context sensitivity to the jump button that I don't want to introduce for this game, right? That's basically where I'm coming from with it. But I think, I didn't want to give too much advice about how to approach this problem in the context sensitivity video itself. And I'm still, I wouldn't even call myself a developer at this point. But the way I've been approaching this in my head isn't to just say, okay, context sensitivity means you can't do this and you can't do that and you can't do this and you can't do that, right? Another way to think about it is reverse that premise, and you realize that maybe there are some things you can do that you couldn't do before, right? If you say we're not going to do that because it's too context sensitive, maybe something else has opened up which wouldn't make sense, right? So the example for this game is one thing that you couldn't do, right? I think this would really be crossing the line that everybody would realize, okay, there's a problem here, right? If you can fall through floors by holding down and pressing the jump button, one thing that you really couldn't do is you couldn't have a difference between the jump and a crouched jump, right? Because that would just be now all of a sudden whatever your crouch jump does, it's totally cut off when you stand on a semi-solid for some arbitrary reason, right? It's just you can't do that anymore. But because we don't have that interaction, we can do a special crouch jump instead. So I've added that in, and it looks pretty rough at the moment, but I think it's an interesting interaction. Where if I jump regularly, I go about that high, and if I crouch jump, I come up faster. So there's a little bit of a delay on it if you just press the button, but you can hold both buttons to get it ready. And then if I come up faster and I go higher, right? And for the way I'm picturing the visual for this is that the wings would flap right as you let go of the button to kind of show I'm putting more oomph into the jump, you know? And it's got a little bit of nuance to it, because when you jump, obviously you keep your horizontal speed, but you can't have horizontal speed while you're crouched. So you lose your horizontal movement, but you gain more of a jump. And to me, this is the kind of thing which doesn't even have to be mandatory in the game, but maybe there are places where it could be useful. Maybe there's an enemy that charges at you and you need to, get at it from behind, right? But if you just do a regular jump, it's quite tight. Whereas if you wait for him to come to you and then do a high jump, it's easy to get over him, right? Or maybe there's a semi-solid placed just the right height so that a regular jump won't get up to it, but a high jump will, and you can skip a little part of the stage that gives you trouble or something like that. So it doesn't have to be mandatory, but it's a little something that we can put onto the controls that wouldn't really make sense if you could fall through floors. And by the way, I really like that you can't fall through floors in Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection. Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection doesn't even give you anything in return for that, and I still really like that game, and I still like that decision in that game. Just because you know that when you jump, right? You don't have to be worried about when you press the down button. But I did want to try and give something back to the player for taking that away, and I think this is a nice trade-off. Right, probably about time I talk about that floating guy on the screen. He might remind some of you of Ghosts and Goblins. Yeah, he's based on the shield guy from Ghosts and Goblins, but the game won't actually have an enemy type like this. Sometimes I just see things in games and I want to implement it for fun. And that's one of them. But he does have some new stuff on him. So this all ties together. I'm going to show off the projectiles now as well. This is going to look a lot more flashy than you're expecting, but I have to test out all the particles and stuff like that. So there's 3 interrelated things that all got worked on here, and all have to play nicely together. There's projectiles, there's damage types and reactions, and damage targets is a way of thinking about this. And there's these new things called reflectors and deflectors, right? So in the past, one of the things I did, which I can't show in the video because it's a tool basically that I made, is I added in a hitbox generation tool where I can bring any character into this screen in the I don't know how to put it. Anyway, I bring any character into this screen, and basically I can use the mouse to draw rectangles over where I want to place their hitboxes, so that I can do it very precisely and quickly. In prior videos, I was just typing the values in manually, which was time consuming, and because you always get it a little bit wrong and you have to adjust it and blah, blah, blah. So I wanted to make sure I could speed that up, and that I could get some nice precise hitboxes like this if needs be, right? So once I had that tool, I was thinking, well, what else can I do with this, right? Because thinking about the game, I know there's a gun, and I know one of the things I want in the game is I want for some enemies to have reflective material that can reflect your shots back at you. So I thought this would be another good thing that would work similarly to hitboxes. So all of these things can be done with that tool that I made. And I think of them, because I call these the player and enemies actors, I think of them as props. These are props that the actors hold on themselves, right? So the purple part that you can see on that guy is a reflector, and the blue part is a deflector. A reflector will reflect projectiles, a deflector will just eat projectiles and get rid of them, and the red part is a hitbox like usual. So if I shoot this guy, hopefully I won't hit him in the red part because that will kill him, but if I shoot him, you can see my shot gets reflected back at me, right? And this isn't in this video because I try not to put too much work into these videos specifically because it takes away from actual development. I already put this uppercut in just for the sake of this video. But I did have that put in at some point where, it does change damage target. So that's a whole other thing. Is I wanted to make sure that damage sources, I forget if I actually have this on hitboxes yet, but it's on projectiles anyway. A damage source has damage targets, right? Because sometimes you want enemies to be able to hit each other and maybe sometimes you don't. So think of it like if you have an archer. I don't know about you, but when I think of an archer shooting a shot, right, I think that they're aiming that shot so precisely they're probably not going to hit another enemy, right? Even if that enemy actually passes through the projectile, you kind of picture it as being on a different layer because it's targeting the player specifically. You know what I mean? Whereas you might have other things like a bomb or something like that, something that's a little bit more chaotic where it can hit anybody, right? And of course, I want to be able to experiment with these things because maybe I have an idea where, oh, it would be cool if that could hit enemies as well, but it turns out to be overpowered because the player can just bait them into using it too much or something like that, you know? So it needs to be easily tweakable. So that's in now, and it has a bunch of different like combinations of things that it can attack, even though there's really just, the game as envisioned is really just player versus enemy. There's not any NPCs or anything like that. And yeah, another thing that I maybe could have put more effort into showing for this video, but I didn't really want to go and add a bunch of stuff specifically just to show it off, is the projectiles can have different behaviors. So they can bounce off terrain, for example, and they can bounce in different ways, or they can come to a stop, you know, all kinds of different behaviors, kind of similarly to what the player can do, you know, the way they can bounce off stuff, or they can, when you uppercut into a ceiling, do you bounce off it or do you stick to it or whatever, right? Basically, when I'm doing things like this, I just play games and I go, okay, I think of a game that I think does this stuff well, and then I try to match as much of it as I can. And for the projectiles, I was playing Caro Blaster. So they're not at a Caro Blaster level, but, you know, the bubble gun from Caro Blaster is probably possible with the projectile systems that I've set up so far. But maybe the flamethrower isn't. That's the kind of level that it's at. And maybe it doesn't need to be, you know. But I wanted to make sure that it was something that I could add a lot of behaviors to later if necessary. And I think it's at that place. So yeah, the reflectors work and the deflectors work and all that kind of stuff. Okay, I'll move on. There's sloped semi-solids as well. I did find right before I stopped to focus on the context sensitivity video, I did notice a bug with these on a 45-degree angle, the steepest slope. I think I was slipping through it under some circumstances, which is not good. So I don't know if there'll actually be sloped semi-solids in the game. I'm certainly not going back to touch up collision anytime soon because I feel like it's in a good place and there's already enough functionality there that it would kind of be overkill. But these gentler slopes would probably work under all circumstances, and they could even have a kind of wobble to them and stuff like that as well. There's no reason why they couldn't have that. So yeah, sloped semi-solids. And also there's a bunch of tile shapes. This was actually, I wouldn't say it was surprisingly time consuming, but it was a bit more of a job than I expected it to be. We want to make sure that there's some natural tile shapes, as you can see underneath, right? So these are not regular slopes, you know, they're moving up and down in kind of weird patterns that, you know, irregular patterns, right? As the game is currently envisioned, most of it will take place indoors in a more structured environment where these tiles probably will not get a lot of use. But at least for the first level, I think I do want to have it outdoors where it's a more natural environment, you know? Because you make your way into the pagoda, right? And yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we finalize these and come up with patterns that can be mixed and matched in many ways. So I kind of had to sit down and think about this a little bit and come up with some, because the problem is that these tiles need art for them if they get used, right? So you can't just have, what you can, but you don't really just want to have like any arbitrary random combination of, you know, tile shapes and slopes that you can have, right? You want to come up with a set number. So I think the number that I have right now is 32. I'd say it's 32 at most. It's about 32 irregular tiles, and they can be mixed and matched to create these kinds of slopes. So they can go in all kinds of different ways, because what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to come up with little 8 tile batches that would repeat, because then as a player you go, oh, it's this kind of random bump in the ground again, right? You know, if the point is to make a more natural environment, then you want it to be more random. And likewise, that's what these little tiles here are for as well. They can kind of stretch out any height. So there's one of these for every different height possibility, and it helps us break off the grid a little bit as well, which is nice. This is a nice interaction of the semi-solids, which was kind of hard to get working right. This is one way that doing semi-solids can trip you up, because generally, as I talked about in the past, when you have slopes, the slope is kind of trying to push the player onto the slope, right? The players, when you walk into it, the player by default doesn't see it, let's say, and wants to walk forward as usual, and the slope has to kind of push them upwards. So you can kind of you can get stung by this, where you walk here and then all of a sudden you pop up onto the top of the slope, right? So I wanted to make sure that this interaction works correctly, where you can walk past the semi-solid and then walk onto it. Okay. I feel like there was probably more to say about the damage types and reflectors and stuff like that, because that was quite a lot of the work. Yeah, individually they're not all that complicated, but they're the kind of things that need to be built with each other in mind, And I'm sure there's some stuff I've overlooked there that I'll have to figure out again or something. But I wanted to make a good, clean first attempt at it. This is just experimenting with different tile shapes. And one thing to keep in mind here is these little tiles on the side here kind of break it off the grid, right? But the art for whatever this is, let's imagine this is just a stockpile of boxes or something with some stuff hanging off the side, right? It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be that all of these things are tiles, right? It could just be one big art asset that covers this whole kind of trapezoid or whatever, pyramid shape, whatever it is, and it just gets slapped on there and it covers all of that, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be tiles, and I think that this might help us create little set pieces and little landmarks for the levels more easily by having these kinds of odd shapes that you can make. Okay, that about covers the tiles. One thing so up ahead there's an enemy emitter which is going to emit one flea. I try to call them the jumper these days, but I never remember. I'm trying to get out of the habit of calling them by insect names, because it kind of traps you creatively in thinking about them as real world insects, right? So I try not to think about the main character as a beetle, just try to think of him as a samurai and try to think of that thing as a jumper rather than a flea. But I'm probably just going to call it a flea a lot. Anyway, so there's an enemy emitter up ahead that works the opposite way to the way most enemy emitters will work. For demonstration purposes, it'll spawn in when it's on screen or close to being on screen, whereas enemy emitters usually work the other way. I want to spawn stuff in when it's off screen, or when it's off screen, a little bit outside the bounds of the screen, so that the player doesn't see the enemy spawning in. And actually this enemy emitter thing, which is not really going to get shown off very well in this video, but you can almost kind of see it in a previous video, because it builds on the particle emitters. So the particle emitters actually have all of the same logic about how they spawn stuff, right? Am I in view? Am I out of view? Is the player in a certain area? Are they outside of a certain area? Blah, blah, blah. And these are all just options that I can pick in the room editor when I'm editing like a specific emitter. I just go in and there's a list of options for me that I've set up that I can just pick whatever I want, right? And of course I can choose which enemy it spawns and how many it spawns and how often and blah, blah, blah. So those, the visual stuff with the emitters and shaders certainly was a break from doing less enjoyable stuff like collisions, but it wasn't just a waste of time on visuals, visual stuff that's not relevant yet. It actually proved to be very, very useful for the enemy emitter, which took almost no work to get going once I just pulled in all of that emitter stuff, right? So there's going to be an enemy up ahead, and I'll show him in a minute. But before I do, I just want to show some of the player's actions, because I've been working on them, right? So hopefully it won't spawn in here. Let's try and get an empty screen. Okay, the player character. Well, I already showed the high jump, and I think that will feel a lot better with better visuals with a wing flap on it and stuff. And maybe I can tweak the speed on it. But generally, you have two ways of attacking. You have the slash and you have the gun, right? That's me touching the camera stick, right? Okay, so you have the slash and you have the gun. One of the things I was unsure of, whether or not I was going to be able to do this, or whether it would be too much hassle, or whether it just wouldn't work, was the protagonist obviously has two pairs of arms. So I thought it would be interesting if you could slash and use the gun. Like if you could have a slash ready and use the gun, right? So let me just talk about the sword first. Let me rewind a little bit. The sword. Okay. So I don't know if the audio will be synced with the video here, but if you listen to the controller, okay, I'm pressing the button and there's a little bit of a delay, like the whip in the Castlevania games. So you don't get your hitbox instantly, and it's a little bit tricky, right? You have to come to terms with it. You have to get used to the idea that there's a little bit of a delay before your hitboxes will come out. But one interesting thing about this, one thing that I was thinking about was, because this takes so long to happen, it's there are some games, I don't know how to phrase this, there are some games where they have kind of a delay to your actions because the game needs to work out whether you've done a press or a hold, right? So the game actually has a very little bit of input delay that happens because they've mapped two things to the same button, right? This is kind of like the opposite of that, I think. Maybe, I don't know. But because a press happens faster than the slash happens, this means there's actually enough time to work out whether it's a press or a slash or a hold, like before it becomes relevant, right? So if I just press, I get that, but if I hold, it just stays on that ready frame. And what that allows me to do is, the second I release, the instant the button is released, I'll get the hitbox, right? So you can imagine this being very useful for a novice player where sometimes you just want to slash, but you're not used to the timing on it, so you decide to hold and just wait until the time is right and let go, okay? But of course, I don't want the player to be holding the attack button all the time. That's not very elegant. So it has to come with a downside. And the downside is that you get a movement penalty. So if you're holding a slash, you move like this instead. And you're locked, your direction is also locked as well. Now, I mentioned this on the Patreon, but for anybody who was unclear what I meant, this is what I was talking about when I talked about looping impulses, okay? This is when you just walk, you move at a set constant rate, right? You can see, if you look at the screen scroll, it's more obvious because these temp sprites don't have much animation, right? So look at the way the screen is scrolling. It's very smooth, right? But if I hold down the slash button, it has a stop and a start to it, right? So this is a looping impulse. So it's got a curve. It's got a different interpolation to it, a curve. And it's starting over from the beginning every time it reaches the end. But it still has a curve to it, right? So it means that you stop and start like that. And again, like I talked about in the Patreon, the inspiration for that was playing Dragon's Crown, because I was playing the dwarf, and the dwarf has kind of a swagger to him. So he kind of has this just on his basic movement, actually. There's a little bit of a back and forth. And after I made that post, I played the knight, and the knight has it even more extreme on his walk. So if you look at his walk, the knight in Dragon's Crown, he's got kind of a stop and start to him, right? And I thought that was cool. And again, like, I go, I'm going to go play Carol Blaster now because I'm doing projectiles. I'm like, okay, I have to have this in the game now, right? This looping impulse thing. And it's turned out to be a really handy thing, which has been used in a few places already. This is the main place it's used right now. It's just on this kind of stepping animation. Okay, so we have that. We know that we can hold a slash, and the protagonist has two pairs of arms, so you should also be able to shoot at the same time, and you can, like so. Now, all of this is, subject to design changes, so maybe this turns out to be too powerful or something, I don't know, right? But I think it is not so powerful because you're still locked into that slow movement speed, so it feels like it has enough of a downside to it that it's okay. And apologies about these little hands that I've drawn in. That one's not even a hand. Look at that. Yeah. Anyway, so if you crouch, you can shoot. There's all kinds of like combinations of things that you can do. You can crouch, but when you're crouching and holding a slash, you can't move because I figured that's too strenuous, right? That slash looks terrible on the ground. That's my fault. But you can do that, right? You can crouch, slash, you can shoot, crouch, shoot. You can jump and you can hover, and the hover has a little bit of a kind of Yoshi's Island sort of flutter to it where it goes up a little bit higher. I don't know if that will stick. I don't know if that's entirely appropriate for the character or not. Maybe there's a different thing I can do, but I would like for it to not just be, you hover at the exact same height that you're at. I would like for it to have some kind of nuance to it, Of course, you can crouch jump and then go into a hover. And you can hold your crouch jump at the ready. But you can't Can't slash then. Maybe you should be able to slash here as well. I'm not sure. But there's all these kinds of combinations of actions that you can do because of the fact that you have two pairs of arms, you know? Anyway, so that's what it's like on the player side. And then I'll show you this Flea, and this Flea is a lot more representative of what the sprites in the game would actually look like. So you can see he's more fleshed out. And I'm a little bit torn on this because on the one hand, it's a Flea covered in a rag, so it's not that impressive, right? But I think the movement on it is very fluid. It may actually have too many frames of animation. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it will actually be viable to animate everything at this kind of animation level. I don't know, because there's a lot of frames happening here to give it these nice movements. You know, like when it comes down to the ground and the cloak flaps down behind it. I think it looks great, but I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be viable or not. Anyway, I can slash this guy. Of course, he's not much of a threat when it's just by itself, and there's only going to be one at a time in this video. I have obviously play tested with it and some other enemies that are in the works. But yeah, it's not much of a threat when it's by itself, but it does have... I want to talk a little bit about where I want to go with the design for this game. And again, it's all subject to change. I don't know if this is going to work out, but I'll just tell you what I'm thinking about it, right? As you can see, it has a glide that it can do, and it does it semi-randomly. In fact, I'm thinking that every action that every enemy takes in the game will be semi-random, right? It will never be fully deterministic what an enemy is going to do at any given time. They will always have a slight chance to do something different, right? Or maybe even a 50-50 chance in some cases. They'll have different behaviors they can pick between. But let's say they know what the right move is to make in a specific case. Doesn't necessarily always mean they'll do it, because doing the wrong thing can catch you out sometimes, right? If an enemy becomes really predictable, then that's actually easier than just if it sometimes makes a mistake, right? So these guys, they will actually... he did it right there. Usually when the player character is a certain distance away, they have a much higher chance to glide, but they don't always do it, right? Only most of the time. So he'll probably glide here, but he didn't. Okay, right. That's cool. So this guy has a low jump and a high jump, and then at the apex of the jump, it can either glide or not glide, and that gives you 4 total jumps that it can do, and each of them have very different arcs from each other. So you have to be prepared for a lot with just this little thing. And of course, not very threatening by itself, like I said. Although what I'm doing right now of just standing under it will become a lot more difficult when slopes are involved and all that kind of stuff as well. You have to factor in, you know, slopes and semi-solids and all these kinds of things where it's not always as obvious where the jump is going to go, right? Anyway, so there are 2 ideas here that I'm drawn to. I'm drawn to the idea of the enemies having a multitude of actions that they can do. So I think that compared to something like Castlevania and Ghosts and Goblins, the enemy count in this game will be lower, but maybe the total number of actions that the enemies can do is higher, right? Especially when you factor in that kind of combinatorial approach of the jump into the glide or the jump into the no glide, right? High jump, low jump, glide, no glide, right? And then there's another thing that I want to do. I do think that this may be more difficult than it seems right now and may not work out, but I want there to be a certain amount of interplay between the player and the enemies, right? So what do I mean by that? Okay, let's imagine I'm a novice player, right? And for these guys, they're not so easy to hit when they're jumping, right? Let's ignore the crouch shot for a moment, right? But if your rate of fire was lower than this, let's say, these guys wouldn't be very easy to hit, right? Or like you wouldn't be guaranteed to catch them when it jumps like that, right? I might miss them. So, but because they jump in at you at an arc that really is covered a lot by your sword, you probably want to slash them, right? As they come in on top of you. And if you're a novice player, then you probably don't want to time the slash the way I'll try and time it here. Yeah, I got it wrong, right? So I pressed it too late because I didn't account for the delay, right? So if you're a novice, you probably don't want to time the slash perfectly. What you want to do is you want to hold your sword, right? So let's try that out. Okay, worked out okay that time. Okay. So the enemy has a hook into the player character that says, if the sword is ready, don't jump because it's too dangerous. Okay. And this is what I mean when I say I want there to be a certain amount of interplay. And it's something that I think is important to me in terms of the setting as well. I've talked about this repeatedly, but the fact that they're insects, I don't want them to be dumb. Like, I don't want that to be an excuse for them to be behaving dumb, because the game, in that sense, it's more like Oddworld, right? Where you think of a relatively dumb creature in Oddworld as like a slig, right? But sligs can speak. They're still pretty smart, right? In the grand scheme of things. So I want them to be more like that, where maybe these fleas aren't the most intelligent thing, but they're still reasonably intelligent. Like, in my mind, that flea has a level of intelligence about on par with a slig or something like that, right? In this world. I mean, that's why it's wearing clothes, for example, right? It's just a rag, but it's clothes. So it's important to kind of approach this from the gameplay angle as well, I think, and try to give them counterplay to the stuff that you do. And I think it leads to a nice escalation. Now, one way this becomes difficult, like, it's easier for the sword, although actually the sword did need kind of I don't want to, at the risk of sounding self-serving here, kind of a clever system, right? It needed to use bitwise flags that can be set for each action that kind of convey different things. Like, how do I explain this? Okay, right. If I slash, that's one action, right? If I crouch slash, that's a different action, because it has to be, right? It has to have different hitboxes. It has to have, the player character has a different collision thing. Maybe it imparts, like, this imparts different, restrictions and stuff. I can walk when I'm doing it, right? And in fact, walking is its own state, because, like, stance walking, I'm calling this stancing, right? Stance walking is its own state. It has to be, because it has its own sprites, it has its own movement, it has its own, priorities, things that you can do when you're doing that, right? So actually, even though it just looks like a slash, if you're walking, that has to be a different state. If you're standing, that has to be a different state. If you're shooting at the same time, that has to be a different state, because it has to animate. It has to, if you're walking like this, it locks you in place when you shoot, right? It also spawns a projectile. So all of these things are stored as a state. But in order to do this cleanly, of course, the flea has to just see all of those things as you have the sword ready, right? So I had to add another thing to the state machine, which I call action flags, right? And these cover a variety of different things like stancing, crouching, jumping, right? And they're just different flags that I can set on each action, which the enemy can use to inform their decision making, right? And these flags can be shared by many different states, right? They can be, so lots of different states can be crouching, right? I can be crouch shooting, or holding a slash when I'm crouching, or just crouching by itself, blah, blah, blah. I think you get the idea. And also there's other things that might be useful here as well. It introduces another thing where, let's say there's recovery animations for certain things, like on the slash. There's no real recovery on it right now, but there probably should be in the final game, right? There's a recovery on that. Maybe there's a high jump thing where you hit the ground hard, like there was when I had Victor in the game, right? That's not here right now, but maybe it will be. And I think that these things could have a vulnerable flag on them, which triggers enemies to be more aggressive under certain, like, if they're ready to be aggressive, maybe the vulnerable flag is the thing that they do that sets them off, right? Like, now's my chance. So I think that covers a lot of different things, but it is complicated by the fact that the player has a gun, because when the gun is in play, like, for example, with this flea, right? In my mind, like, maybe at some point the game just becomes impossible to play, right? But I want to play test this, and I want to try it out, and I want to try and go in this direction if possible, right? In my mind, what happens now is the flea says, I'm not going to jump, okay? But the player says, okay, I'll just crouch and shoot you instead, okay? So now the flea needs another level of decision making, which is, if I'm on the ground, if I have a jump ready, if I'm ready to jump, and the player's gun aligns with me, I'm in danger and I should jump, right? Even if a slash is ready, I probably want to jump. And this leads to maybe a whole kind of thing where, of course, you could just forgo all this by slashing the thing when it comes in with that harder timing, right? Or you can get the slash ready, and then, let's say he's out of it's out of range. It actually, there's a range on, if you're wondering why you jumped it, there's a kind of range. If it's close enough, it will jump because it's in danger anyway, right? So let's say it's not jumping at me right now. And then I crouch, and then it sees that the gun has lined up with it, and then it jumps, and then when it jumps on top of me, I slash him, right? Like so, right? I think that sounds cool anyway. I don't know, maybe it's too much, but something I'd like to explore anyway. And of course, I'd like to explore this with other enemies as well, depending on what actions they have. If the player is doing this, I don't want to do this, and I want to do that instead. There's another enemy. It's not ready to be shown yet, but we're working on it, and it can, like I said, there's deflectors, right? And this thing has a deflector that it can do. So it's got a spear, and it can use the spear to deflect. That's the idea right now. Whether or not this thing will make it into the game or not, everything's up in the air, right? But it can use the spear to deflect temporarily. So what happens is, if you hit it with a gunshot, it starts deflecting because it knows that if you shot it once, you probably want to shoot again, right? Little things like that. Those kinds of things where it's not just running at you, it's not just doing a preset behavior, it's actually responding to the things that you're doing. The problem there, though, the gun will definitely need a lot of consideration, because what it needs to do is it needs to, first of all, the game needs to know where your gun is at each time, which is different depending on your state, right? If you crouch, the gun is lower. And maybe there'll be differences, like maybe shooting now shoots higher up than shooting if you have the thing ready, where you're doing more of a hip shot or something. I don't know. All of these things are just little nuances that need to be worked out, right? So the game will need to know what the gun height is, and then it will need to do a kind of ray cast or a sensor or something, so that if there's a wall in the way, the player or the enemy doesn't think that the gun is a threat when it isn't, And I could see this stuff being exploitable, and maybe that's why I don't see it in games more often. I don't know. But it's definitely something I'd like to explore, and it's the direction that I want to go with the enemies. So I think that covers it. I think at this point I'd be repeating myself. So just a word to say where I'm going with this. For now, the focus is on enemies, right? I think this game, because after this, maybe you see now this game is going to kind of live or die by its enemies, I think, right? For the most part. So I want to get a bunch of enemies made before focusing on anything else, because if that's not fun, then, there's no point making the game, right? So there has to be a bunch of enemies working, and it's got to be fun to play against them together. What I can say is I have play tested it with the Flea, or a couple of Fleas on screen and spawning in and stuff, and another enemy type, maybe two other enemy types at the same time. And I did have fun. Now, wasn't a huge amount, like if I'm gauging it, right? It's not polished, finished game levels of fun, but there was something there. There was actually something there where I enjoyed myself playing it and like factoring in, okay, this Flea is coming at me and this other guy is coming here and I need to focus this and that, right? The gob-like element. I felt the gob-like element and I enjoyed it. So, got to focus on enemies. And I think the workflow that we've had for enemies right now has not been good. So that's the big thing that I want to address after coming back from the context sensitivity video. I feel like in terms of generating art, I didn't give my artist enough to go on about specifically what needs to be done for each enemy type. Actually, coincidentally, Masahiro Sakurai, who is a YouTuber and now has the exact same job as me, he put up a video just recently talking about animations, and I can't remember what he called it, but it was something about conveying animations to the team or setting up animations or something like that. Anyway, it was uploaded about a day before this video. And that's the kind of stuff that we're working on now, right? And I just didn't do a good job of doing that in the first place, so that slowed us down. But we're going to reassess how we do that going forward to make it more clear and just prototype more quickly, get something that's fun, and then once it's fun, polish it up into a full sprite like the Flea that you're seeing there, right? Wait until it's fun, get a bunch of different actions in, see what it can do, and then polish it up. So that's the phase that we're at right now. And then I don't know how much more work I want to do on, there's probably gimmicks I can put into different levels, different stage hazards and things like that. But I think instead of doing that, when we have, let's say we have an enemy that's coming along well and it's time to just do more art for it, I think what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go work on Proxima while that's happening. So I'll be splitting my time between this and Proxima because, kind of frustratingly, right before I focused on the context sensitivity video, I had a good idea for Proxima, and I'd like to explore that now that I have a chance. So we'll see. I still don't know if there's anything there, but I'd like to work on that. And the number one priority right now is just to get a game made, right? I know I'm my own worst enemy in this, and I know it's not going to happen overnight, and there's still a long way to go. But I can assure you, I understand that the goal is just to get something out the door, right? I really want to get something made. So that's the goal. But for now, I'm probably going to be splitting my time between Mushido and Proxima to try, because again, Proxima is smaller, better chance of getting finished. Maybe there's something there. I would love to get that done and just have something in your hands, right? But yeah, for those of you who are worried about, a video spelling the doom of these projects, not so. There hasn't been any, programming in a while, but I'll get back to it. And I don't know when the next update will be, but I hope to have something to show to you soon. Okay. Probably going to be a little while though. Okay. All right. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time, whenever that is. Bye bye, everybody.